Did a white boy from Mississippi help the civil rights movement? Or did he just get rich from the work of black artists? People have been fighting over that for more than 60 years. Elvis Presley, you know the name. You know the sneer. You know the songs. But his story is tangled up with the story of race in America. And he grew up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi. He lived in a black neighborhood in Memphis. He soaked up the blues and gospel music he heard on the street and in the church. Then, in 1954, he walked into Sun Records and changed everything. He sang black music for white kids. The establishment hated it. They called it vulgar. They called it a threat. Segregationists saw it as race mixing, a direct attack on their way of life. They burned his records. Preachers condemned him from the pulpit, but the kids didn't care. They loved it. They bought his records by the millions. For many of them, it was the first time they had ever heard anything like it. It was their first real exposure to black culture. So, was he a revolutionary? It's a bridge between two worlds. Or was he just a thief? A performer who took a sound he didn't create and made a fortune, while the original artist struggled. This isn't a simple story with a simple answer. The truth is messy. To find it, we have to look at the evidence. We have to look at what people said then and what they say now. We have to look at the music, the money, and the man. Here are 19 historical papers, each one a piece of the puzzle. Each one asks a hard question. Together, they try to get to the bottom of Elvis Presley's strange and powerful influence on the fight for civil rights. Number 19 was That's All Right, a Cover or a Conquest. This paper is titled The Sun Studio Sessions, A Sonic Desegregation. It was written by music historian Dr. Evelyn Reed. It focuses on a single day, July 5th, 1954. That's the day Elvis Presley, Scotty Moore, and Bill Black were in Sun Studio in Memphis. They were messing around during a break. Elvis started singing That's All Right, a blues song by a black artist named Arthur Big Boy Crudup. Sam Phillips, the studio owner, heard it. He told him to start over, and he recorded it. That moment is often called the birth of rock and roll, but Reed argues it was more than that. It was an active cultural collision. Crudup had recorded his version in 1946. It was a classic piece of Mississippi blues. It was raw and emotional. Elvis's version was different. It was faster, it had a nervous energy, it mixed Crudup's blues with the country sound of Bill Black's upright bass. It wasn't black music, it wasn't white music, it was something new. When local DJ Dewey Phillips, no relation to Sam, played the record on his show, the phones lit up. Listeners were confused. What was this? Who was this? Many assumed the singer was black. When Dewey revealed Elvis was white, the requests went through the roof. The paper details the financial reality. Well, Arthur Crudup received almost no royalties for That's All Right. He died in poverty in 1974. He had to fight for years just to get some back payment. Elvis, on the other hand, became a superstar. This is the central conflict. The paper doesn't call Elvis a thief, it calls him a translator. He took a language, the blues, that white audiences couldn't or wouldn't understand and translated it into a dialect they could accept. He was the friendly, handsome white face on a sound that America's segregationist culture had kept hidden. The paper argues this translation, while commercially unequal, had a profound social effect. It pushed black music out of the race records category and into the mainstream. It forced a conversation. Dr. Reed quotes Michael T. Bertrand, author of Race, Rock, and Elvis, who wrote that rock and roll created a breach in the wall of segregation. Elvis didn't build the wall, and he didn't tear it down, but he kicked a hole in it. A hole big enough for a whole generation to peek through and see what was on the other side. The song itself was an act of integration, blending musical styles in a way that mirrored the social changes that were just beginning to bubble up. So, was it a cover or a conquest? The paper concludes it was both. It was a cover song that conquered the charts and the culture. It made Elvis a king, but it left the original creator, Arthur Crudup, a pauper. It was the first, most important step in a complicated legacy. It was an act of appropriation that also unintentionally became an act of liberation for the music itself. What did Sam Phillips really mean when he said he needed a white man with a Negro sound? Was he a visionary who saw the power of cultural fusion, or just a businessman who saw a gold mine? How many other white artists were trying to do the same thing at the time, and they just failed where Elvis succeeded? If Arthur Crudup had been paid fairly from the beginning, would the entire history of rock and roll royalties be different? Number 18. Did television make Elvis a threat to segregation? This paper is called From the Waist Up, The Television Appearances of 1956 and the Fear of a Desegregated Future. It was written by media analyst David Albright. He argues that Elvis's early TV appearances were a visual earthquake that shook the foundations of 1950s American society. It wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about the body. It was about a white man moving in a way that white audiences associated with black performers. On January 28, 1956, Elvis made his national television debut on the Dorsey Brothers stage show. He was raw, electric, he gyrated his hips, he sneered. This was not Perry Como. This was not Frank Sinatra, this was something else. Albright analyzes viewer letters and newspaper columns from the time. The reaction was split down the middle. Young people were mesmerized, their parents and authority figures were horrified. And words like vulgar, savage, and animalistic were used, These were the same words segregationists often used to describe black culture. The most infamous appearance was on the Milton Berle show on June 5th, 1956. He sang Hound Dog. He moved his body in a way that was, for the time, incredibly suggestive. The performance caused a national scandal. The next day, the New York Times called him an entertainer with a vulgar style. A Catholic publication called his performance a spiritual leprosy. Albright argues that this outrage wasn't just about sex. It was about race. Elvis was performing a black woman's song written by two Jewish men in a style heavily borrowed from black stage performers he had seen on Beale Street in Memphis. He was a white man channeling black energy into white living rooms. This led to the famous Ed Sullivan Show compromise. On his third appearance on January 6, 1957, the cameras were instructed to film Elvis only from the waist up. The producers were trying to censor his body to contain the threat, but Albright says this act of censorship backfired. It made Elvis even more powerful. It told every teenager in America that there was something so dangerous, so thrilling about him that the adults had to hide it. And what was that dangerous thing? It was the cultural fusion, it was the sound and the movement of a desegregating America. The paper concludes that by showing a white body moving in a black way, Elvis visually challenged the rigid racial lines of the 1950s. He was a walking, talking, hip-shaking symbol of the cultural mixing that segregation was designed to prevent. Did Ed Sullivan and other TV producers really believe they were protecting public morals, or were they responding to pressure from advertisers in the South? What if Elvis had been allowed to perform without any censorship? Would the backlash have been even more severe, potentially damaging his career? How many black performers at the time could have done the exact same moves, but were denied access to national television simply because of their race? Number 17 was Beale Street, Elvis's classroom. This paper is titled Walking in Memphis, Elvis Presley and the Black Cultural Education of Beale Street. It's a sociological study by Dr. Marcus Thorne. The paper moves away from the recording studio and television screen and focuses on Elvis's youth in Memphis. It argues that his unique style wasn't just a product of talent, but a direct result of his environment. After his family moved to Memphis in 1948, they lived in a public housing project that was near a black neighborhood. As a teenager, Elvis was drawn to Beale Street. In the 1950s, Beale Street was the heart of black culture in the South. It was a vibrant strip of blues clubs, theaters, and shops. It was a place where black people could create and celebrate their own culture in a segregated city. It was also a place where a poor white kid like Elvis, who didn't fit in with the mainstream white culture, could feel a connection. Thorne's paper uses oral histories and interviews with musicians who were on Beale Street at the time. They remember seeing Elvis there. He wasn't a tourist. He was a student. He was watching. He was listening. B.B. King, who was already a star on Beale Street, remembered the young Elvis. He said Elvis was a regular. He wasn't arrogant. He was respectful. He was there to absorb the music. The paper details the specific things Elvis would have learned. He learned about performance style from watching bluesmen command a stage. He learned about fashion from the sharp, colorful zoot suits and flashy clothes sold at Lansky Bros, a clothing store on Beale Street that catered to black musicians. Elvis would later become a lifelong customer. He was building his entire persona from the cultural materials he found on Beale Street. Thorne argues that this was a radical act for a white teenager in 1950s Memphis. Segregation wasn't just a set of laws, it was a powerful social code. It said that white and black worlds should not mix. By crossing that line, by physically entering the black cultural space of Beale Street, Elvis was defying that code. He was engaging in a form of personal cultural desegregation long before he ever made a record. The paper makes a crucial point. Elvis didn't just steal the music, he lived near it. He breathed it. He respected the people who made it, even if the system he benefited from did not. This education, Thorne concludes, is what made him different from other white singers who tried to sing the blues. He had an authenticity that came from real-world experience, not just from listening to records. How many other white kids in Memphis were also hanging around Beale Street, but lacked the talent or ambition to do anything with what they learned? Did the black musicians on Beale Street see Elvis as a welcome fan, a curious outsider, or a potential threat to their own cultural ownership? If Elvis had grown up in a white suburb instead of near a black neighborhood, would his music have had the same revolutionary power? Number 16. Did Elvis's success hurt or help black artists? This paper, The Double-Edged Dollar Elvis Presley and the Economics of Race Music, is an economic analysis by Dr. Anita Desai. It tackles one of the most difficult questions in the Elvis story, the money. The paper starts with a stark fact. In the 1950s, the music industry was segregated. There were the pop charts for white artists, and there were the rhythm and blues charts, then called race records for black artists. It was rare for a black artist to cross over to the pop charts, but white artists could take a song from the R&B charts, record a cover version, and have a huge pop hit. Pat Boone did this all the time, making sanitized, family-friendly versions of songs by artists like Little Richard. Desai argues that Elvis was different. He didn't sanitize the music, he amplified it. He took the raw energy of R&B and made it even more explosive, but the economic result was often the same. Take Hound Dog. It was first recorded by a powerful blues singer named Big Mama Thornton in 1952. Her version was a #1 hit on the R&B charts. She reportedly received a single check for $500. 4 years later, Elvis recorded it. His version sold over 10 million copies. It became one of the best-selling singles of all time. The songwriters Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, who were white, became rich. Elvis became richer. Big Mama Thornton died in 1984 in a boarding house, nearly broke. The paper presents this as Exhibit A in the case against Elvis. He was the primary beneficiary of a fundamentally racist system. But then Desai introduces the other side of the argument. Elvis didn't create this system. He was just the one who broke it open. Because Elvis was so huge, he created a massive new market for rock and roll. And he was always clear about his influences. In interviews, he would name drop the black artists he admired, like Arthur Crudup and B.B. King. He introduced their names to a white audience that had never heard of them. This created a gateway effect. Kids who loved Elvis started seeking out the original artists. The record companies, seeing the money to be made, started promoting black rock and roll artists more aggressively. Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, they all had huge crossover hits in the wake of Elvis. Little Richard himself had a complex view. He often complained, rightfully, that he didn't get the credit he deserved, but he also acknowledged Elvis's role. He was an integrator, Little Richard said. Elvis was a blessing. They wouldn't let black music through. He opened the door for black music. Desai's paper concludes that Elvis's success was both a great injustice and a necessary evil. He reaped rewards that should have gone to others, but in doing so, he created an economic tide that, while it lifted his boat highest, also lifted many others. What if the music industry in the 1950s had been integrated? Would artists like Little Richard and Chuck Berry have been even bigger stars than Elvis? How many black artists saw a temporary boost in sales because of Elvis's name dropping, only to be forgotten again a few years later? Is it possible for an artist to be both a product of an exploitative system and an agent of positive change at the same time? Number 15 was the army a political tool to silence a cultural rebel. This paper is called General Presley, The Draft, The Haircut, and the Taming of a Revolution. It's a political science paper by historian Robert Chen. It examines the period from 1958 to 1960, when Elvis was drafted into the U.S. Army. On the surface, it was a straightforward story. The most famous young man in America was fulfilling his patriotic duty. But Chen argues it was much more complicated. He suggests that drafting Elvis was a convenient way for the American establishment to neutralize a cultural threat. By 1958, Elvis was the most controversial figure in the country. He was a symbol of youth rebellion. His music and his performances were seen by conservative forces as a direct assault on traditional values and racial segregation. As journalist Ed Sullivan, who had once been a critic, said, "He is a definite danger to the security of the United States." Chen presents evidence that there was quiet, high-level discussion about the Elvis problem. The draft was the perfect solution. It would remove him from the public eye for 2 years. It would take this wild rebel and put him in a uniform, subject him to military discipline, and give him the most famous haircut in history. The paper analyzes the media coverage of Elvis's induction. It was a massive news event. The photos of him getting his head shaved were sent around the world. Chen argues this was a symbolic act. It was the establishment publicly taming the wild man. It was a message to the youth of America: see, even your king has to bow to authority. The plan worked. When Elvis returned from the army in 1960, he was different. He was more subdued. He started making lighthearted movies and recording ballads instead of raw rock and roll. The rebellious edge was gone. Chen connects this to the civil rights movement. In the late 1950s, the movement was gaining momentum. The Montgomery bus boycott had happened. The Little Rock Nine had integrated Central High School. The cultural rebellion that Elvis represented was happening at the same time as this political rebellion. By neutralizing Elvis, by turning him from a rebel into a clean-cut soldier, the establishment was able to blunt one of the sharpest edges of the youth culture movement. It separated the cultural rebellion from the political one. The paper concludes that the drafting of Elvis Presley was one of the most successful acts of soft power in modern American history. It didn't silence him with force, but with a uniform and a haircut. It preserved his popularity while stripping him of his revolutionary potential, right at a moment when that potential was needed most. Was there any direct, documented communication between government officials and the draft board about making an example of Elvis? How much of Elvis's change in style after the army was due to this taming versus a natural artistic evolution or a business decision by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker? If Elvis had resisted the draft like Muhammad Ali did years later, would he have become a true political icon, or would it have destroyed his career? Number 14, what did black intellectuals and activists say about Elvis? This paper is titled A White Man's Voice, A Black Man's Soul, African-American Perspectives on the King of Rock and Roll. Authored by cultural critic Dr. Lena Washington, this work compiles and analyzes the opinions of black leaders, writers, and musicians on Elvis, both during his life and after. It reveals a deeply divided and complex response, far from the simple narratives of theft or admiration. Dr. Washington starts with the early years. In the 1950s, many in the black press saw Elvis as a positive, if complicated, phenomenon. Publications like Jet Magazine and the Chicago Defender covered him frequently. They noted his respectful attitude towards black musicians and his open acknowledgement of his musical roots. They saw his popularity as proof of the power and appeal of black culture. There was a sense of pride that a sound born in their communities could take over the world. The paper quotes a 1957 article from a black newspaper, the Amsterdam News, which defended Elvis against his white critics, stating, "He has done more to link the white and Negro races than all the speeches of all the politicians." However, as the civil rights movement intensified in the 1960s, the mood began to shift. Elvis was in Hollywood, making movies. He was largely silent on the major political issues of the day of the marches, the sit-ins, the violence. This silence was seen by many as a betrayal. He had built his career on black culture, but when that culture was fighting for its very survival, he was nowhere to be found. Dr. Washington includes quotes from activists who felt he had a moral obligation to speak out. James Brown, a contemporary and a giant of music in his own right, had a nuanced view. He respected Elvis's talent and acknowledged his role in opening doors, but he also said, "I wasn't just a singer, I was a force for my people. I was a civil rights leader." This implicitly contrasted with Elvis, who was just a singer. The paper also addresses the infamous and likely apocryphal quote attributed to Elvis, "The only thing Negroes can do for me is buy my records and shine my shoes." This quote first appeared in a 1957 magazine article and has dogged his legacy ever since. Elvis vehemently denied ever saying it. Dr. Washington presents evidence from black journalists and musicians like B.B. King who knew Elvis and said it was completely out of character for him. Yet, the fact that the quote spread so widely and was so readily believed shows the growing mistrust and frustration with his perceived silence and exploitation. The paper concludes that the black community's view of Elvis was not monolithic. It was a spectrum, ranging from gratitude for his role as a cultural ambassador to anger over his commercial success and political silence. He was both a symbol of cultural breakthrough and a symbol of white privilege. Why did the "shine my shoes" rumor persist for so long, even with so many people who knew him personally denying it? Did his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, actively prevent him from making political statements to protect his brand and Southern fan base? How would the black community's perception of Elvis have changed if he had, for example, joined the March on Washington in 1963? Number 13 was the 68 comeback special, a political statement. This paper is titled "If I Can Dream Elvis, the King Assassination, and the Televised Plea for a Nation's Soul." It's a deep analysis of a single television event written by media historian Dr. Frank Miller. The paper argues that the 1968 comeback special was far more than just a career move. It was Elvis's most significant, if indirect, contribution to the civil rights conversation. The context is crucial. 1968 was one of the most turbulent years in American history. The Vietnam War was raging. Protests were everywhere. And on April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, Elvis's hometown. The nation was reeling. Elvis himself was said to be deeply shaken by the event. He was in the middle of preparing for his first television special in years, a show that was intended to be a simple Christmas program. The assassination changed everything. Dr. Miller's research, based on interviews with the show's producers and writers, reveals that Elvis became determined to say something meaningful. The show's director, Steve Binder, encouraged him. They scrapped the cheesy Christmas theme and went for something raw and relevant. The result was a show that was gritty, powerful, and surprisingly political. The famous black leather performance was a reclaiming of his rebellious roots. But the most important part, according to Miller, was the finale. The show was supposed to end with a standard Christmas song. Instead, Elvis performed a brand new song written for the occasion, "If I Can Dream." The lyrics were a direct response to the chaos of 1968 and Dr. King's assassination. They were inspired by King's "I Have a Dream" speech, "If I can dream of a better land, where all my brothers walk hand in hand, tell me why, oh why, can't my dream come true?" Elvis sang this with a passion and sincerity he hadn't shown in years. He was dressed in a white suit, standing in front of giant letters that spelled Elvis in red lights. Miller argues this was a calculated image. The white suit was a stark contrast to the black leather. It was a symbol of hope and purity. The performance was a sensation. It was a powerful, mainstream call for peace and unity at a time of intense division. For the first time in a decade, Elvis was not just an entertainer, he was part of the national conversation. The paper concludes that while Elvis never marched or gave a political speech, "If I Can Dream" was his sermon. It was his eulogy for Dr. King. It was his way of using his massive platform to echo the message of the civil rights movement to an audience that might never listen to a politician or an activist. It was a quiet, musical form of activism, but for millions of people, it may have been the most powerful they had ever heard. Did Elvis personally connect the song to Dr. King's speech, or was that connection made primarily by the songwriter and director? How many of the millions who watched the special understood the song's political subtext versus just hearing it as a generic inspirational ballad? After the success of "If I Can Dream," why didn't Elvis record more songs with social or political messages? Number 12. Did Elvis desegregate his audience audiences? This paper, "The Rope Line Concerts, Crowds, and Crossover in the Segregated South," is a historical investigation by Dr. Susan Boyle. It looks at a less examined aspect of Elvis's influence, the physical spaces where he performed. The paper argues that Elvis concerts, especially in the early days, became unintentional battlegrounds over segregation. In the mid-1950s, most public events in the South were strictly segregated. There were separate entrances, separate seating sections, and often separate nights for white and black audiences. Boyle's research uncovers newspaper accounts and city ordinances from the time related to Elvis's performances. She finds a consistent pattern. Elvis's music attracted a mixed audience from the very beginning. White kids wanted to see him. Black kids who recognized the R&B roots of his music also wanted to see him. This created a problem for promoters and city officials. One of the most famous examples detailed in the paper was a concert in Memphis in 1955 at the Ellis Auditorium. The promoter had to get special permission for a mixed race show. The solution was a rope line. They literally ran a rope down the middle of the auditorium to separate the white and black attendees. But according to eyewitness accounts Boyle collected as the concert went on and Elvis started performing, the energy in the room became so intense that the kids started dancing. The rope line was ignored. Teenagers, both black and white, were dancing to the same music in the same room together. For a moment, the music had overcome the segregation. The paper documents other instances. In some cities, officials tried to ban Elvis from performing using public safety or morality as an excuse, but the real reason was often a fear of race mixing. A juvenile court judge in Jacksonville, Florida, threatened to arrest Elvis if he moved his body suggestively at a 1956 show, a clear attempt to control the integrated excitement he generated. Boyle argues that these small moments of de facto desegregation were significant. They didn't change any laws, but they changed experiences. For a white teenager in Alabama or Mississippi, standing in a room with a black teenager, both screaming for the same singer, was a new and powerful experience. It normalized shared cultural space. It suggested that the lines drawn by society were not as permanent as they seemed. The paper concludes that Elvis's concerts were micro-laboratories for integration, showing that a shared culture could be a more powerful force than a divisive political system. How often did these moments of spontaneous desegregation at concerts lead to violence or arrests after the show was over? Were black teenagers attending these shows risking their safety to be there? Did Elvis or his management ever consciously try to book venues that would allow for integrated audiences? Or were they just following the money, regardless of the seating policies? Number 11, who is Otis Blackwell and why does he matter? This paper is titled The Ghost in the Machine Otis Blackwell, a black songwriter behind the White King's biggest hits. It's a biographical study by music journalist Michael Harmon. The paper shines a light on a crucial but often overlooked figure in the Elvis story. It argues that to understand Elvis's sound, you have to understand Otis Blackwell. Otis Blackwell was a prolific African-American songwriter. He was a master of the rock and roll formula. He wrote songs that were clever, catchy, and full of raw energy, and he wrote some of Elvis Presley's most iconic hits. Don't Be Cruel, All Shook Up, Return to Sender. These songs are fundamental to the Elvis legend, and they were written by a black man. Harmon's paper explores the relationship between Blackwell and Elvis's publishing company. It was a business relationship, but a complicated one. The paper details the financial arrangement. Blackwell was a songwriter for hire. He would often sell his songs outright for a few $1,000s. In a now famous story, he sold the rights to Don't Be Cruel and 6 other songs for just $25 each. Later, he had a better deal where he retained some royalties, but there was a catch. To get his songs recorded by Elvis, Blackwell often had to agree to a co-writing credit for Elvis Presley. This meant that Elvis would get half of the songwriter royalties even though he didn't write the song. This was a common, if unethical, practice at the time, insisted upon by Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, to maximize profits. Harmon argues this was a clear case of economic exploitation. Blackwell, due to his race and lack of industry power, was forced into an unfair arrangement. Yet, the story is more complex. Blackwell himself rarely expressed bitterness. He was a professional songwriter who was proud of his work. He knew that having Elvis record his songs was the surest way to a massive hit and a steady income, even if it was a reduced one. And unlike some other artists, Elvis's versions of the songs were often very close to the demo recordings that Blackwell made. Elvis respected the source material. He wasn't changing the songs, he was channeling them. The paper concludes that the story of Otis Blackwell is a perfect microcosm of the entire Elvis and race debate. On one hand, you have a white superstar getting rich and famous from the creative genius of a less powerful black artist. On the other hand, you have a symbiotic relationship. Blackwell's songs gave Elvis his signature sound. And Elvis's voice gave Blackwell's songs a global audience they never would have had otherwise. Harmon's paper forces the reader to confront the uncomfortable truth that a relationship can be both exploitative and mutually beneficial at the same time. Did Elvis ever meet Otis Blackwell in person? The evidence is unclear, and the story is a source of debate. How many other black songwriters had to agree to similar co-writing deals with powerful white artists? If Otis Blackwell had been white, would he be remembered today as one of the founding fathers of rock and roll, as famous as Chuck Berry or Little Richard? Number 10. How did the South react to its native son? This paper is called Prophet or Pariah: The White Citizens Councils versus Elvis Presley. It's a historical analysis by Dr. Charles Reagan. It focuses specifically on the reaction to Elvis in the white segregationist South. The paper argues that the people who should have been his biggest supporters, his fellow white Southerners, were often his most vicious critics. They saw him not as a hometown hero, but as a traitor to his race. Dr. Reagan's research digs into the archives of the White Citizens Councils. These were organizations of white segregationists, often made up of middle-class and upper-class community leaders who fought to maintain the racial hierarchy of the South. They saw Elvis as a major threat. His music was derived from black culture. His performances were sexually suggestive and challenged traditional morals. Worst of all, he was wildly popular with young white people, especially young white women. He represented everything the councils were fighting against: cultural mixing and the breakdown of racial barriers. The paper includes pamphlets, newspaper editorials, and speeches from council members denouncing Elvis. They used racist language, calling his music jungle music and a Negro ploy to corrupt the white youth of America. They organized record burnings, where teenagers were encouraged to bring their Elvis records to be destroyed in public bonfires. Preachers gave sermons condemning him as an instrument of the devil. The leader of one segregationist group in North Carolina claimed, "Elvis Presley is a chief instrument in the communistic plot to brainwash American youth." Reagan argues that this intense hatred from the white establishment is a crucial piece of evidence. If Elvis was simply a culture thief with no real impact, why were these powerful segregationist groups so afraid of him? They were afraid because they saw that he was effective. He was succeeding where politicians and activists were failing. He was making black culture attractive to white kids. He was desegregating the culture from the inside out. He was a fifth columnist in the war for segregation. The paper shows that the very people most invested in maintaining racial purity saw Elvis as one of their greatest enemies. Their fear is a testament to his influence. By being so hated by the forces of segregation, he was in effect working against them, whether he intended to or not. How much did this backlash in the South actually hurt Elvis's record sales, or did it just create more publicity and make him even more popular with teenagers? Was Elvis personally aware of the specific campaigns against him by the white citizens' councils, and did it affect him? Did any of these segregationist leaders ever change their minds about him later in his career when he became a more mainstream patriotic figure? Number 9. What was Elvis's personal relationship with black musicians? This paper is titled Brothers in Music: Personal Testimonies of Elvis's Interactions with African American Artists. It's an oral history project compiled by Dr. Sarah Jenkins. The paper moves beyond public perception and economic analysis to look at direct personal relationships. It gathers quotes, interviews, and anecdotes from black musicians who knew, worked with, or met Elvis. The picture that emerges is consistently one of respect and admiration. Jenkins begins with B.B. King, the king of the blues. B.B. King knew Elvis from the early days in Memphis. He stated unequivocally, "I saw him as a brother. He was a beautiful guy. He had a respect for black music, black people." The paper includes similar testimonies from many others. Jackie Wilson, a dynamic black performer, often compared to Elvis, called him a great friend. James Brown, while critical of the system that elevated Elvis, always spoke of him with personal respect. He attended Elvis's funeral in 1977. The paper highlights the story of Mahalia Jackson, the legendary gospel singer. And Elvis adored her. He considered her one of the greatest singers in the world. When he was preparing for his '68 comeback special, he reportedly listened to her records for inspiration. This wasn't a public performance of admiration. This was a private act of artistic respect. The paper also tells the story of the Sweet Inspirations, a black gospel group that became his backup singers in Las Vegas. The members of the group, including Cissy Houston, Whitney Houston's mother, have spoken at length about how well Elvis treated them. He paid them well, featured them on stage, and treated them as artistic equals, not just employees. This was at a time when black backup singers were often kept in the literal and figurative background. Dr. Jenkins argues that these personal testimonies are a vital counterpoint to the narrative of Elvis as a simple exploiter. While he benefited from a racist system, his personal actions often contradicted it. He did not exhibit the personal prejudice that was so common among white Southerners of his generation. He saw these black artists not as a resource to be mined, but as peers and masters of their craft from whom he could learn. The paper concludes that it is possible to hold two ideas at once, that the economic system surrounding Elvis was unfair, but that the man himself held genuine, non-racist attitudes and built respectful relationships with his black contemporaries. His personal decency does not excuse the systemic injustice, but it does complicate the story. Are there any credible, first-hand accounts from black musicians who had negative personal experiences with Elvis? How much of the positive testimony is genuine affection, and how much is professional courtesy or a reluctance to speak ill of a dead icon? If Elvis had lived longer into the 80s and 90s, would he have collaborated directly with black artists from the worlds of R&B, soul, or hip-hop? Number 8, was Las Vegas a retreat from or a continuation of his influence? This paper is titled The White Jumpsuit in the Desert Elvis in Vegas and the Whitewashing of a Revolution. It's a cultural studies analysis by Professor David Chen. It examines the final phase of Elvis's career, his long residency in Las Vegas from 1969 until his death in 1977. Chen argues that this period represented a final, tragic retreat from the cultural front lines. The paper contrasts the Vegas Elvis with the early, rebellious Elvis. The young Elvis was a symbol of danger and integration. The Vegas Elvis was a symbol of mainstream entertainment. He was safe, he was family-friendly. He was playing to a wealthy, predominantly white, older audience. The raw rock and roll was replaced by polished orchestrations. The black leather was replaced by bejeweled white jumpsuits. Chen argues that this transformation was a form of cultural whitening. The black influences were still there in the music, but they were buried under layers of showmanship and spectacle. The paper analyzes the set list from his Vegas shows. He still sang the old rock and roll hits, but they were often part of a medley rushed through. The emotional center of the shows was often big, dramatic ballads. He was no longer a rebellious kid channeling the blues. He was a showbiz institution. Chen connects this to the changing racial landscape of America. By the 1970s, the civil rights movement had achieved many of its legal goals. But the cultural conversation had moved on. Black power, funk music, and soul were now the dominant forces in black culture. Elvis, in his Vegas bubble, seemed disconnected from all of this. However, Chen also offers a counter-argument. Even in Vegas, Elvis was doing something unusual. His band, the TCB band, was a mix of white and black musicians. His backup singers were black. His opening acts were often black comedians or musicians. In the context of a Las Vegas showroom, which was a bastion of old school, often racially segregated entertainment, Elvis's stage was one of the most integrated places on the Strip. And he was quietly presenting a vision of interracial harmony to an audience that might not have seen it anywhere else. The paper concludes that the Las Vegas years were a paradox. On one hand, Elvis became a caricature of himself, a de-radicalized version of the rebel he once was. On the other hand, even in this safe, commercialized environment, he continued to practice a form of personal and professional integration that was still meaningful. It was a quieter influence, but it was an influence nonetheless. Was the move to Las Vegas a personal, artistic choice by Elvis, or was it purely a financial decision driven by his manager to avoid the risks of touring? Did the integrated nature of his stage show have any measurable impact on the hiring practices of other Las Vegas performers? How did black audiences and critics view the Vegas Elvis at the time? Did they see him as a sellout or as a veteran performer? Number 7. Can we separate the man from his manager? This paper is titled The Colonel and the King Tom Parker and the Management of a Cultural Firestorm. It's a business and historical analysis by Dr. Jennifer Wallace. The paper focuses on the immense and often negative influence of Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker. It argues that many of the criticisms leveled against Elvis, his political silence, his commercialism, his bad movies, can be traced directly back to the decisions of the Colonel. Colonel Parker was a master promoter, but he was also incredibly conservative and risk-averse. His primary goal was to make as much money as possible while protecting the Elvis brand. Wallace's research shows that the Colonel viewed Elvis not as an artist, but as a product. And for a product to have mass appeal, it couldn't be controversial. This meant avoiding politics at all costs. The paper presents evidence that Parker systematically shut down any opportunity for Elvis to make a political statement. He controlled Elvis's access to the press. He screened interview questions. He turned down offers for Elvis to appear at events that could be seen as political, including, it is rumored, requests for him to support the civil rights movement. Wallace argues that Elvis's silence was not necessarily a reflection of his own apathy, but a result of the professional cage the Colonel had built around him. The paper explores the psychological control Parker had over Elvis. Elvis was loyal to the Colonel, who had guided him from poverty to unimaginable wealth. He may have felt unable or unwilling to defy him. This is crucial for the civil rights question. Elvis may have held progressive personal views on race, but he was managed by a man whose only color was green. The paper also connects the Colonel to the issue of cultural appropriation. Parker was the one who insisted on the songwriting credits that took money from writers like Otis Blackwell. He was the one who pushed Elvis away from his rock and roll roots and into the safe, lucrative world of Hollywood movies in the 1960s, precisely when the country was in turmoil. Wallace concludes that it is almost impossible to fairly judge Elvis's legacy on race without factoring in the Colonel. We are left with a huge unanswerable question. What would Elvis have done without the Colonel? Would he have spoken out? Would he have marched? Would he have used his fame differently? The paper suggests that the rebel of 1 to 956 was slowly but surely suffocated by the businessman who managed him. The real Elvis's views on the most important social issue of his time may be a secret that died with him, locked away by his manager. Is there any proof that Elvis ever tried to defy the Colonel on a political or social issue and was overruled? How much did Colonel Tom Parker's own shadowy past, he was an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands, contribute to his desire to keep a low, non-controversial profile for his client? If Elvis had fired the Colonel in the mid-1960s, what would his career and his social impact have looked like? Number 6, what does the King of Rock and Roll title really mean? This paper, Unseating the King, the Politics of a Title and the Erasure of Black Pioneers, is a critical theory essay by Dr. Imani Perry. It examines the cultural and racial implications of Elvis's most famous nickname, the King of Rock and Roll. Perry argues that this title, while seemingly harmless, is a powerful example of how white society co-opts and rebrands black cultural inventions. The paper begins by establishing that rock and roll was created by black artists. It was a fusion of blues, gospel, and rhythm and blues. Pioneers like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Bo Diddley were the architects of the genre. Chuck Berry, in particular, was a master songwriter and performer who defined the sound and attitude of rock and roll. Little Richard was its most flamboyant and energetic force. Yet, it was a white man, Elvis Presley, who was crowned the king. Perry argues that this wasn't an accident. It was the result of a music industry and a media landscape controlled by white interests. They needed a white face for this new, exciting, and potentially threatening music. Elvis was the perfect candidate. He was talented, handsome, and most importantly, white. By calling him the king, the media effectively demoted the black originators to the status of court jesters or minor nobility. It created a narrative that rock and roll began with Elvis, erasing the history that came before him. The paper notes that Elvis himself was reportedly uncomfortable with the title. There are several accounts of him in concert referring to Fats Domino as the real king of rock and roll. He seemed to understand that the title was not entirely his to claim, but his personal humility didn't change the public perception. The title stuck, and for decades it has shaped the way popular music history is understood. It placed a white man at the top of a black musical hierarchy. Dr. Perry concludes that the debate over the in-king title is not just about music history. It's about cultural ownership. It's about who gets to tell the story and who gets to be the hero. By crowning Elvis, white culture was able to celebrate a black art form without having to celebrate black people. It was a way of enjoying the fruits of black creativity while maintaining the racial status quo. The paper challenges the reader to think critically about such titles and to question the historical narratives we have been given. It suggests that perhaps rock and roll shouldn't have a single king, but a whole royal court of black innovators who built the throne that Elvis was later placed upon. If Elvis had publicly and forcefully rejected the king title throughout his career, would it have made a difference? Who first called him the king of rock and roll, and what was their motivation? How has the continued use of this title in media and marketing affected the legacies and financial earnings of the families of black rock and roll pioneers? Number 5, did his gospel music reveal his true feelings? This paper is titled, In My Father's House, Elvis Presley's Gospel Recordings and a Theology of Integration. It's a musicological and theological study by Dr. Lincoln Hayes. The paper argues that the most sincere expression of Elvis's views on race and spirituality can be found not in his rock and roll music, but in his gospel recordings. Elvis loved gospel music. It was his favorite genre. It was the music he grew up with, singing in church in Tupelo. Throughout his career, he returned to it again and again. He recorded 3 gospel albums and won all 3 of his Grammy Awards for this music. Hayes argues that this was not a commercial calculation. Gospel music was not a huge seller compared to his pop hits. This was a passion project. This was the music that was closest to his heart. The paper analyzes the style and content of his gospel music. Elvis didn't just sing white Southern gospel. He was deeply influenced by black gospel music. He admired artists like Mahalia Jackson and Sister Rosetta Tharpe. His gospel recordings are a blend of both traditions. He took the tight harmonies of white quartets like the Statesman Quartet and infused them with the passion, rhythm, and call and response energy of the black gospel church. His Grammy-winning album, How Great Thou Art, 1967, is a prime example. It includes traditional white hymns alongside songs deeply rooted in the black spiritual tradition. Hayes argues that this musical fusion was a spiritual statement. In the sacred space of gospel music, Elvis created a sound that was fully integrated. It recognized no color line. It was a musical enactment of the beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. often spoke of. The paper suggests that while Elvis may have been silent on political matters in his gospel music, he was preaching a sermon of unity. He was showing through his art that the deepest expressions of faith from both black and white traditions could not only coexist, but could create something beautiful and powerful together. The paper concludes that anyone who wants to understand Elvis's soul and his true feelings about the culture he borrowed from must listen to his gospel records. This was the one area where he was not just an interpreter or a performer, but a true believer. And what he seemed to believe in, musically and spiritually, was a world where the lines between black and white voices disappeared in a single harmonious choir. Why were the Grammy Awards, which often overlooked his rock and roll innovations, so willing to recognize his gospel music? Did black gospel artists at the time view Elvis's gospel recordings as a sincere tribute or as another form of appropriation? How did Elvis's deep love for gospel music coexist with the hedonistic and often troubled lifestyle he led in his later years? Number 4. What is the Elvis did versus Elvis? Didn't debate. This paper is The Binary King, a historiographical analysis of the 2 dominant narratives of Elvis Presley and race. It's a study of how the story of Elvis has been told over time, written by historian Dr. Maria Flores. She argues that the entire public conversation about Elvis and civil rights has been trapped in a false, overly simplistic binary. So Flores identifies the 2 opposing camps. The first is the Elvis did school of thought. This is the traditional celebratory narrative. It argues that Elvis was a revolutionary force who broke down racial barriers. It points to his love of black music, his desegregation of the airwaves, the hatred he received from segregationists, and his personal relationships with black artists. In this view, he was an unconscious but powerful ally of the civil rights movement. He was a good man who did a good thing, even if he didn't realize it. This is the narrative often promoted by his estate and his most devoted fans. The second camp is the Elvis didn't school of thought. This narrative gained prominence in the 1980s and 90s, particularly with the rise of hip-hop and a more critical look at cultural appropriation. The Public Enemy song, Fight the Power, famously declared, "Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant shit to me. Straight up racist." This view argues that Elvis was a thief who got rich and famous from black innovation. It points to the economic injustice, his political silence, during the height of the movement and the way the media crowned him king, erasing the black pioneers. In this view, he is a symbol of white privilege and cultural theft. Dr. Flores' paper argues that both of these narratives are incomplete. They are both based on truth, but they both ignore the inconvenient facts of the other side. The Elvis did camp often ignores the real economic exploitation. The Elvis didn't camp often ignores the documented hatred he received from racists and the genuine respect many black artists had for him. The reality, Flores argues, is not a simple either-or, it's a messy both-and. The paper concludes that the enduring power of the Elvis story is that it forces us to confront these contradictions. He was both a bridge and a beneficiary. He was both an admirer and an appropriator. He was both a rebel and a product of a racist system. Flores suggests that instead of trying to decide if he was good or bad for civil rights, we should see him as a mirror. His story reflects the complex, contradictory, and often hypocritical nature of race in America. He is not the answer to the question. He is the question itself. Why did the Elvis didn't narrative become so powerful, specifically in the late 1980s? What social and cultural shifts made that critique resonate so strongly? Is it possible to create a new, more nuanced public narrative about Elvis, or are we forever stuck in this binary debate? How much of this debate is really about Elvis the man, versus Elvis as a symbol for larger, unresolved issues of race and culture in America? Number 3, how do we reconcile his generosity with his privilege? This paper is titled, "The Cadillac and the Credit Elvis Presley's Philanthropy as a Complicated Form of Reparation." It's a sociological study by Dr. Ben Carter. The paper examines Elvis's legendary and often impulsive personal generosity and asks whether these acts can be viewed in the context of his enormous privilege, which was built on a foundation of black culture. Elvis was famous for giving away cars, houses, and money. He gave to friends, family, and complete strangers. There are countless stories of him buying Cadillacs for people he admired. Many of the recipients of this generosity were black. He famously bought a Cadillac for his backup singer Cissy Houston. He financially supported many of his childhood friends from the integrated housing project where he grew up. He regularly donated to charities in Memphis, many of which served the black community. Carter's paper analyzes these acts of charity. On one level, they are simply the actions of a kind and generous man who came from poverty and never forgot it. He knew what it was like to have nothing, and he enjoyed sharing his wealth. The paper documents dozens of these instances, showing a consistent pattern of private, often unpublicized giving. However, Carter also puts this generosity under a more critical lens. He asks, can these individual acts of kindness be seen as a form of informal, personal reparation? The argument is this: Elvis built his fortune on a musical form created by black Americans. The system was structured so that he received a vastly disproportionate share of the financial rewards. Perhaps, on some conscious or subconscious level, Elvis understood this imbalance. Perhaps his acts of giving, especially to black individuals and communities, were his way of trying to balance the scales. It was a way of giving back, not just as a general philanthropist, but as someone who owed a specific cultural debt. It wasn't a formal apology or a political statement, but a personal, tangible acknowledgement of the source of his success. The paper concludes that this is a complex and perhaps unprovable thesis. We can't know Elvis's true motivations, but viewing his generosity through this lens adds another layer to his story. It complicates the idea of him as a simple thief. A thief takes and does not give back. Elvis took, or was given by the systematic, a great deal, but he also gave a great deal back, albeit on his own personal, unstructured terms. It doesn't fix the systemic injustice, but it paints a picture of a man who may have been trying, in his own way, to do the right thing, even if he couldn't or wouldn't articulate it politically. How many of Elvis's charitable donations were publicly known during his lifetime versus those that only came to light after his death? Did his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, try to limit his spontaneous giving, seeing it as a financial liability? Is it fair to interpret personal charity as a form of social or political action, or are they two completely separate things? Number 2, what if he had lived? This paper is a speculative historical analysis by Dr. Eleanor Vance titled "The Post-1977 Elvis, a Counterfactual History of a Living Legend in a Changing America." The paper engages in a thought experiment. What if Elvis Presley had not died on August 16th, 1977? What if he had lived into the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond? How might he have confronted his complicated legacy on race? Vance argues that the 1980s and 90s brought a new level of racial consciousness to American popular culture. The rise of hip-hop forced a direct conversation about race, appropriation, and cultural ownership. And artists were more politically outspoken than ever before. How would an aging Elvis have fit into this new world? Vance proposes several possible scenarios. In one scenario, Elvis continues on his Vegas-style path, becoming a beloved but largely irrelevant oldies act, completely disconnected from the contemporary cultural conversation. His silence on racial issues would have become even more glaring, and his legacy likely would have been cemented as that of a cultural appropriator by a new generation of critics. In another more optimistic scenario, the changing times force Elvis to confront his past. Perhaps a collaboration with a black artist like Michael Jackson or Prince would have been proposed. Perhaps an interview with a journalist like Oprah Winfrey would have forced him to answer the hard questions he never had to in his lifetime. Vance speculates that an older, more reflective Elvis might have finally spoken his mind. He might have used his platform to talk about his love for Arthur Crudup and Otis Blackwell, and to advocate for them to be recognized and compensated. He could have become a powerful voice for honoring the pioneers of the music he helped popularize. He could have used his fame to fund music education programs in inner-city schools. The paper suggests that his death froze him in time. It left his story unfinished. He died before the full force of the critique against him had truly formed. He never had the chance to respond, to evolve, or to make amends. Because he died in 1977, we are left to argue about the man he was. If he had lived, he would have had the chance to show the world the man he could have become. The paper concludes that the greatest tragedy of Elvis's early death, from a cultural perspective, is that it robbed us of the final chapter of his story, the chapter where he might have finally reconciled the two halves of his legacy. Given his health problems and isolation in his final years, is it realistic to think he would have had the capacity for such a public and personal evolution? How would the rise of MTV and the music video era have treated a 50-year-old Elvis? Would he have adapted, or would he have been left behind? If he had lived to see the Fight the Power lyric, how would he have responded to that direct challenge from a new generation of black artists? Number 1. Was Elvis a cause, an effect, or just a coincidence? This is the final paper, a synthesis of all the others. It is titled The Accidental Revolutionary Elvis Presley as a Catalyst in the American Civil Rights Narrative. The author is a senior historian, Dr. Samuel Beckworth. He argues that Elvis was not a conscious actor in the civil rights movement. He was not a protester, an activist, or a political thinker. But history is not only shaped by intentional acts. It is also shaped by powerful unintentional forces. Elvis, Beckworth argues, was one of those forces. The paper frames Elvis as a great coincidence. He appeared at the exact right moment. The post-war economic boom had created a new social category, the teenager. These teenagers had disposable income and a desire for their own culture. At the same time, the civil rights movement was beginning to build momentum, creating a deep, unsettling tension in American society, especially in the South. Into this volatile mix walked a poor white kid from Mississippi who sang black music with a white face. He was the right person in the right place at the right time. Beckworth uses the metaphor of a chemical reaction. The elements for a cultural explosion were already there: the simmering racial tensions, the rise of a new youth culture, the untapped power of black music. Elvis was not one of the elements. He was the catalyst. He was the agent that, when added to the mix, caused a sudden, rapid, and irreversible reaction. He didn't create the energy, he just released it. His success demonstrated on a massive scale that a shared culture was possible. He proved that millions of white kids would embrace black culture if it was presented to them. The paper circles back through all the evidence presented in the previous papers: the sonic desegregation of Sun Records, the visual threat of his television appearances, the integrated spaces of his concerts, the fear he inspired in the segregationists, the economic doors he opened for other artists, the quiet plea for unity in his '68 comeback special. Beckworth argues that none of these things were part of a grand plan. They were the byproducts of a singular artistic phenomenon. He concludes that Elvis Presley's greatest influence on the civil rights movement was accidental, but it was not insignificant. He changed the hearts and minds of young white Americans not by appealing to their conscience, but by appealing to their feet. He made them dance to a new beat, and that beat was the sound of a wall coming down. He didn't push the wall over, but he provided the soundtrack for the generation that would. Did Elvis's influence ultimately delay a more authentic black-led cultural revolution by providing a safe, white alternative for the mainstream? If Elvis had never existed, would rock and roll have still crossed over to white audiences, perhaps through a figure like Chuck Berry, or would it have remained a niche genre? In the final accounting of American history, will Elvis be remembered more for the doors he opened or for the treasures he walked away with?